Future Sense is a podcast edited from the radio show of the same name, broadcast on Bay FM in Byron Bay, Australia at bayfm.org. Hosted by Nick Jeans and well-known international futurist Steve McDonald, Future Sense provides a fresh, deep analysis of global trends and emergent technologies. How can we identify the layers of growth, personally, socially, and globally? What are the signs missed, the truths being denied? Science, history, politics, psychology, ancient civilizations, alien contact, the new psychedelic revolution, cryptocurrency and other disruptive and distributed technologies, and much more. This is Future Sense. On now, though. Future Sense is 9:58, and I am with myself, I think, Nick Jeans, I'm here, and Ross Hill, my special guest co-host this morning on this show, and maybe for the next few weeks too. And in the studio, great pleasure to welcome Helena Norberg-Hodge to the studio. Again, a well-known figure in this region. G'day, how are you doing, Helena?
Good day, happy to be here.
For those who don't know Helena, among many other things, has pioneered local movements globally through her organisation Local Futures, written Ancient Futures, a book since translated into some 40 languages. It's pretty remarkable in itself, and created the documentary Economics of Happiness about your time in Ladakh. And interestingly, off air, we were just talking, Russ mentioned that he'd been himself in Bhutan, and that was an interesting story, talking about renewability, resilience, localisation, markets, trade, which we're going to touch into some of these topics here, mentioning the recycling of plastic in Bhutan, and your little tale about that, which you had a great comment about. So what was that, Ross?
Yeah, I was in Bhutan a couple of years ago, and I met a recycling entrepreneur, and he was starting this social venture to collect a lot of the rubbish, and especially the plastics, which had been taking over the area. And he had a good business. It was running. He was collecting a lot of plastic and the usual bottles and things, and he would compact them and then send them across the border to India, where they had a bigger processing plant.
Yeah.
And as an entrepreneur, he was looking at how can he grow his venture and scale what he's doing. And so he was talking to the people with the larger plants, and they said, well, the big plants process a lot of plastic, so you're going to need to collect 3 times as much plastic to justify getting the processing equipment for your own country. And he said, well, we would have to use more plastic and waste more for that to be possible, and so that seems like going backwards. But that's one of the interesting paradoxes and complications here. He couldn't do it locally in his own country because they weren't producing enough waste, and of course the goal is they shouldn't be producing more waste, maybe.
Well, I would say very definitely. I think this is also part of what's happened, is that we've been trained to think too much from the point of view of the needs of big business. The whole world is framing all its activity around how big business is framing the environmental issues, including recycling plastic, rather than talking more about producing a much less plastic, which in turn is linked to strengthening more local economies where you don't need nearly as much plastic. But that's a real threat to big business.
Now, we have you here today because of, as I've already mentioned a couple of times, the Local Futures Convention that you're producing yourself, Local Futures and the Economics of Happiness and New Economy Network Australia, NENA, at the Byron Community Centre, Friday the 20th to the 22nd. And on that topic you just mentioned there are 3 themes of the festival. The first one is understanding the dominant economic system and global market and its impact on democracy and local economies. Just expand a little bit on that. I mean, that's a good example just used there regarding plastic.
Yeah, well, basically I've ended up studying for the last 40 years or so the impact of trade treaties that we just don't talk enough about, that have given global monopolies more and more power over our governments. Our governments have been signing in black and white, we will not do anything that might reduce your profit-making potential. If we do something that would reduce your profits, you can take us to court. Yeah. And these courts are kangaroo courts. Is something that I think almost no sane person would embrace and still pretend that we have a democracy. And we have to remember that these giants are also the giant media conglomerates. They are funding entire universities. So it's penetrating into all our thinking. We're seeing the world through the eyes of giant monopolies, and that's why we're not dealing with climate change the way we should be.
I mean, still a lot of people, while they're probably very suspicious of that structure that you're talking about, I imagine there's quite a lot of people who still don't actually believe how the tentacles of this global organisation actually reach into basically everything in our world. I guess this is part of what you want to bring more attention to.
Exactly. Unfortunately, we need to bring attention to how those tentacles of the, it's like this invisible hand, but it's got tentacles in every arena. And the most frightening thing is in how we frame the issues. For instance, the plastic, but also climate change. It's been framed entirely in terms of blaming the individual.
Yes.
And we hear nothing about these arrangements between global monopolies and government to give them more freedom to take almost all production away from countries where labor is well paid into poor countries in the name of bringing up their standards. But no, they're creating huge monstrosities of sort of slave-like manufacturing. So it's really important that we look at that big picture, and I think it's very important we do it without demonizing or blaming anyone in particular, no particular business, no particular anybody. It's really the systemic direction. Do we want to keep going towards bigger, faster, more global, with ever more waste, ever more resource use, or do we want to start transitioning towards more diversified, more self-reliant, regional, national economies? So when we talk about local, we're talking about moving towards strengthening the local, particularly around food, but generally, even at the regional and national level, diversifying instead of monoculture.
Going back to trade, you mentioned off-air a term I hadn't heard before, and that's insane trade. You can just expand a little bit. I mean, you've already touched on that, but just what that terminology means.
Yeah, well, what it means for us, we have a little campaign, we have a little film on our website, which is localfutures.org.
Yeah. And
what we're trying to raise awareness about there is that countries are now routinely importing and exporting the same product.
Yes.
And when it comes to food, which is something every person on this planet needs every single day, about 3 times a day. So we're talking about 24 billion times a day around the world as people eat. We now have economic policies supported by our governments that separate us further and further from the source of that food. Now, if tomorrow around the world people were eating food from their region, no multinational would make money, but literally millions, well, billions of people would be making more money and benefiting. So it's that type of decentralization we need to understand. But first of all, it starts by understanding that literally the US exports 1 billion tons of beef, turns around and imports 1 billion tons of beef in a year. The UK export, tons and tons of butter and milk in roughly the same quantity as they import. Biscuits, potatoes, water. Australia exports 20 tons of bottled water to England. UK exports 20 tons of bottled water to Australia. So this is going on with wheat, it's going on, and then on top of that...
It's a madness, isn't it? It is insane.
It's totally insane, especially at a time when we're talking about climate change and we're witnessing the effects of climate change. And we know even if nothing else, we know that we need to reduce fossil fuels. We know that for a million reasons, not just climate change.
No,
the toxic effect across the board.
It occurs to me just the fact that we still burn things in order to get somewhere is somehow ancient, really, almost. When we think about it now. You got any comments on some of this, Ross?
Well, yeah, I think it's fascinating because there's so much trade happening across the world, and we're not really sure what's in all of those containers. And you see them on the ships sometimes, and you're like, what's going on in there? And obviously, when you add up the numbers, it doesn't make sense a lot of the time. And so I'm really curious to ask, in terms of the categories of products, it sounds like exporting water and importing water is a bit silly. Whereas my iPhone was produced in China and assembled from parts across the world. Do these different categories make a difference? Like, for technology, does it make sense to centralize some of it? Whereas food, my breakfast came from up the road. I think that makes sense too.
Yeah, I think absolutely it makes sense. You see, because this is also... With technology, there is an efficiency of scale. With food, fishery, forestry, there is basically no efficiency of scale. In fact, the efficiency is the smaller the better. The smaller, the more diversified, the better. And the really important fact is, anywhere in the world, if you take a piece of land 1 square meter or 1 square kilometer and you plant it with diversity, including some trees and bushes and ideally even animals in the cycle, vegetables, etc., you will always be able to produce more than you can on a monoculture. So a monoculture could never compete. The efficiency of industrial monocultures, which we've been told again and again is needed to feed the world, is that it removed people from the land using fossil fuels, machinery, chemicals, chemical fertilizer. So it's highly inefficient in an age of climate change and overpopulation. And I just want to add that we need to understand the difference between someone working on a smaller, highly diversified farm and the difference of someone standing as a migrant worker or a slave in colonial times on some huge cotton plantation or soya plantation, acting like a machine. Then at that time, when you had those enormous slave-like, monocultures, then machinery seemed like progress, but not today.
It was progress at the time.
Yeah, very good point.
Yeah.
It brings up the question that many people do ask about the relocalization of food in particular and the diversity of farming. I think it's fascinating that sort of diversity in a small scale can actually produce more per hectare, per area. But how many people are actually going to go back to the land to do that? I think that's a question that many people ask.
Well, I tell you,
are we just going to be forced to do it?
Right here in the Shire, we have again and again more and more students from the permaculture, even from the Byron College here and from other institutes wanting work. Yeah. They can't get it. Okay. There is a new microtrend. I'm a master of observing small microtrends around the world. I call them ancient futures trends because they're taking us back towards the earth, towards more reconnection.
Indigenous
and more
cultures,
community.
some of the knowledge and wisdom of those cultures.
The wisdom of more deeply connected. And there is a microtrend, and it's even true in China. One of our speakers at our conference was going to be this professor of agriculture who already in about 2000 started a rural reconstruction movement in China. He could see the disaster of everyone leaving their villages and smaller towns to move into Beijing and the giant cities, and is trying to create really thriving economies in rural areas.
How's it going? Is it working?
It is working, but it's a small micro trend, and he can't publicize it too much, but he does have some support from the central government. But it's divided. They're doing both, but there is support for it. So he has achieved quite a lot, and it's very exciting. Unfortunately, he can't come now because of the virus. But we have been,
Well, you'll have them on the screen because I know you've got Dr. David Suzuki, who'll be dialing in, and also Charles Eisenstein, who sat in the studio a couple of times when he was in Australia a few years ago. I really like Charles. I think Charles is great. Yeah, fascinating stuff. We'll take a little bit of a break here on Future Sense with Nick Jeans, and this week with Ross Hill, and our special guest this morning is Helena Norberg-Hodge. We're talking about local futures, and generally you can go to localfutures.org, as Helena already mentioned, for the details about the conference. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we come back.
You're resonating right now on Future Sense with Steve McDonald and Nick Jeans.
Thanks for your text. I might mention this one, thanks to Mia, who's written in, I'm not sure I could be bothered growing all of my own veggies. I find herbs and citrus challenging enough. But would these micro farms be like neighbourhood gardens? I would happily contribute dollars for someone in my street to do the labour.
Well, what we're talking about in the global local food movement, which is growing around the world and is growing much faster than we think, and it's for me why I feel so much more hopeful than most people, because I see around the world a will from the majority of people to do things differently, to treat nature better, to want more community and connection. There's so much evidence. We just have this blind leadership, particularly at national government level, and big giant businesses that are just not close enough to the ground. So we're not talking about everyone growing their own veg. We're talking about reestablishing a balance between farming and the city, in every aspect of our lives. We're going, and we don't see it, but the urbanization is a direct consequence of allowing global monopolies to have so much power. So it's linked to mass urbanization where jobs are concentrated in fewer and fewer big cities. And in those big cities, the house prices shoot up to astronomical proportions. People can't survive. And then you have a few places like Byron and other desirable smaller places where they become so popular for tourist reasons, and very wealthy people want to retire, and they also have very high house prices. But if you go around most countries, you'll find if you go away from those few centers, the house prices are a fraction. of what they are in these few desirable places. And so it's all to do with the economic driving towards globalization. Localization, as we're advocating it, is a decentralization. And no, everyone does not need to grow their own food, but we do need to support the smaller farmers. This is why I helped to start the farmers markets here in Byron.
Yes.
And at least that's supporting a few small growers. And yes, great also if people can grow in their gardens. And really good idea, what you just suggested, is that people get together even in the towns and cities, as they're doing, to help fund community gardens and that kind of thing for those people who want to do it.
Yeah.
And right here in the Shire, we have a lot of young people who would love to do this, but there is no money in it.
Yes.
And
well,
why is that?
Yeah.
That's what localization is
Well, that's
about.
right. And as you already talked about insane trade, to use your terminology there, maybe expand a bit on that, because of course those big trade, that scale trade around the world, is subsidised, it's under-regulated, it's untaxed or little taxed, and all these things. And these elements of government support or lack of, certainly do not apply. The support does not apply to these rising local ventures. Like
No,
that in some way.
and I want to say, in some ways, that's one of the most inspiring things for me, is to see around the world that everyone is operating under this system where virtually everything at the local, regional, even national level is squeezed with heavy regulations and more bureaucracy and regulation and heavy taxes, really squeezed. At the global level, the global players pay virtually no tax, and they have not only no regulations, they are the ones who are now setting the regulation. They're telling governments what to do.
Yeah.
And among other things, they tell them to regulate at the national level. So we have this completely unfair playing field, which also means that they enjoy the freedom of flying things like macadamias from Byron to be cracked open in China, flown back again, apples flown from the UK to South Africa to be washed, flown back again, scallops flown from Tasmania to China to be peeled and flown back again, fish from Norway to be deboned. Every single day this insanity is going on.
Yes.
I discovered it first in the 70s when I was living in and working in Ladakh and Bhutan, and I saw butter coming in from the other side of the Himalayas, selling for half the price of local butter. As I started on a journey to understand this, that's when I saw this insane trade that favors the global traders at the expense of virtually everybody else.
Yes.
And at that time in Sweden, when I went back to Sweden, my native country, at that time they were sending potatoes to Italy by road in big lorries to be washed and put in plastic bags and sent back again by road. Now this is happening by air and across the world, because the logic is the giants that are freed up not to do as they like and not pay taxes, their infrastructure is subsidized. The biggest ports, the biggest airports, it's all for them. The superhighways for them. And they then artificially come into your local economy and deliver the supermarket food at an artificially low price and destroy the local competitors. That's what we have to change. We've got to wake up and we have to start building the local.
Yeah. You've got to comment on the madness of all this and how
It's definitely insanity. And one of the ironies of travel is that, sometimes we'll travel really, really far to learn some of these seemingly obvious things. I had a similar experience in Bhutan. I was shown the local market, and then I was shown the imported market. And it's really interesting once you get to the edges of different societies. That's one of the things I enjoyed going to Uluru in January as well, was once you go to a smaller town or group, things do change. So there was less fresh fruit at Alice Springs, right?
Yeah.
It's far from where we keep all the fruit.
Yeah.
And it's the desert, so you have different fruits that you would grow there. And yeah, similar in Bhutan, like there's 700,000 people, so regardless of what they want to do, it's a small type of place, and they're going to act differently. But in complex systems, we'll often see a wobble happen before a major change, and sort of will often wobble in completely the opposite direction before it reverses. And I think that's been what's so interesting, especially in the last few months, as we've had fires and illnesses and these different things, which are large-scale events across Australia. You can't really avoid them. They've been very in your face. And when the shelf at the supermarket is empty, you do start to ask, like, well, where does this stuff come from, and can we get some more?
Yeah.
And it is interesting to learn, where does the essential items that we use every day come from.
It's important also that Australia, because of, I guess, retail costs, space costs in Australia, that there's a very short storage of all that sort of stuff that goes into our supermarkets. I can't remember the actual amount of time, but it's not very long, as is fuel supplies. I think we have 6 weeks of ordinary fuel supplies.
Yeah.
So your Tesla might be okay, but yeah.
Well, exactly. It depends on the category, right?
Yeah.
And so for some things, you can leave them on the shelf for a year and they're fine. For some things, like especially food, you do want it to be fresh. And so let's get the freshest food we can.
But there we just need to add another issue, which is that for a long time now, big business, knowing that they make their mega bucks through this insane trade and monopolizing, they have invested billions upon billions of dollars into how to make food transportable and have a long shelf life. That includes trans fats, it includes all kinds of things.
All kinds of additives to the food for longevity.
For our health,
Yes.
And not only that, is laden with high fructose corn syrup, which is also toxic to our system. So there are really so many reasons why we want to support the local food movement that is growing and that is so inspiring. I mean, for me, there's almost nothing that gives my, more joy than seeing this new farmers movement. These young people who are just going out and doing it, and they're doing it despite the lack of support, and they love it. So just a little bit of help in that direction would make a huge difference.
Yes.
So part of what we'll be talking about at the conference is how can we in this local area create a much more thriving local economy and have many more small independent businesses. They don't need to be co-ops. There's nothing wrong with private and there's nothing wrong with profit, as long as it's at a scale that we can comprehend and we have the social and ecological parameters shaping business rather than business shaping the culture around the world.
Yes.
And what's happening is what's being imposed is a global consumer monoculture. So monoculture is the essence of that global system, and that means it's anti-life, it's anti-biodiversity.
And of course it impacts things like water, which is another issue, and of course the number of stuff that's stuffed into the soil to supposedly produce better, and to pesticides and so forth, all of that. We've got another comment. I'm not sure if this is the right spelling. It's always hard to know with texts that come in from one of our regular listeners, George. G'day, George. And he says Wicking Gardens. I don't know if you know Wicking, Wicking. Yeah, I'm not sure. Wicking Gardens, I'm not sure what they are. George, if you're listening, which you are, you'll have to maybe text in if that's a misspelling. Very low maintenance and can be a very easy way for anyone to grow food easily on nature strips and front yards. Great conversation, Nick, Ross and Helena. Much love from George. So we'll see if he comes back with that. I thought maybe you knew what a Wicking Garden was.
No, I'm not sure.
Yeah, we'll have to maybe look it up. We don't have much time left now for today's conversation, because you'll be back and some of the other of your guests will be back on some other shows in the next week or so before the conference actually happens on the 20th to the 22nd in the Byron Community Centre downstairs. But I wanted to mention from an recent interview of yours in Paradiso, the magazine, where this quote, just to take it to a bigger picture right now, you say, the closer and more real we get, we see the whole movement is connected to an inevitable spontaneous human reaction to loneliness and alienation. Loneliness from other people and loneliness from plants, from nature. We need a turning towards nature, towards connection. I mean, this is really the sort of value system change underneath this, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's the essence of it. And it's a value system, but it's also really, it comes down to survival. And so I feel we've got such a win-win-win strategy which operates at all these levels of what would reduce our impact on nature, whether it's the plastic or the energy or the mineral use. And at the same time, we can literally become more productive. I mean, that's a miracle formula. And we've been fed with basically a lie, which is that we need bigger and more, more technology, more genetic engineering to feed the world. It's absolutely not true. We need to allow these young people who actually want to farm now. And I can show you so many projects that are emerging around this area that are happening on just, thin air. I don't know how they're managing, but it's not nearly enough yet. Would still probably only constitute about 4% of the food consumed in the Shire. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done. I'm very excited about initiatives that set up local funds where local people come together to try to help move the whole economy in this direction. And when we talk about returning to nature and returning to community, we can see everywhere we look that this is something people long for. We can even see it in Hollywood films, like even Avatar, raising
absolutely.
the status of the indigenous. It's in the air.
Yes, it's in the air.
People want that reconnection.
Yes.
And I would argue that the biggest problem is a lack of awareness about how the economy operates. So that's this sort of invisible, these invisible tentacles are pulling us intellectually and physically in the wrong direction. But people really want this, they're ready for it, and it goes totally across left and right boundaries, which is also so wonderful and so empowering.
Yes, absolutely true.
So as someone who's just recently relocated to this region, where do I find this 4% that you mentioned? Where should I be shopping?
Well, at the farmers markets. The farmers markets
I went to the
definitely
Shannon the other day.
the
That was
best.
good.
Yeah, very good. We need more of those markets, and we also need to understand how precious they are. They're very hard to manage, and particularly because there's a lot of well-funded from big business thinking that says, "Oh, this is elitist. It costs more than the supermarket. This is only about privilege." No, it's a miracle that we're able to do it, because the other stuff is subsidized, and this is happening, just out of the goodwill of people who want to try to do things differently.
Now, a wicking bed, and it is the right spelling, W-I-C-K-I-N-G, is a veggie bed that waters itself from below. It's based on years of experience installing these beds in Melbourne, in fact. And I won't go to the details of it, but you can go to wickingbeds.com.au for details, and thanks to George for that. And that's pretty interesting. There's also things like syncretic farming, which is an interesting area too. I don't know if you're familiar with that, as well as obviously permaculture, which is well known in this area, having emerged from here, in fact, years ago with Bill Mollison.
Yeah, and David Holmgren in the Melbourne area is a fabulous and a friend and colleague, and he's not traveling very much, but maybe he could phone in as well. He's a really great person.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there, Helena, but we'll have you back talking about this on various shows before the Local Futures Convention coming up the 20th to the 22nd. And folks, you probably need to get your tickets for that soon.
Yeah, you do need to get them very, very soon. If you want to get a seat in the auditorium, which I think we only have very few left. But we're doing tickets at a much lower price, with the plenary streamed into the upstairs room on a big screen.
Okay, that's good.
And those tickets are extremely cheap. And we so want people who are interested to come. So if someone can't even afford that, they should write to us at localfutures.org, because we want any and everybody to come if they're interested.
Fantastic. Thanks, Helena, for joining us here on Future Sense. The time is 10:29. We'll be back after a few messages. We're going to go into space shortly for the last bit of the show. Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Future Sense, a podcast edited from the radio show of the same name, broadcast on Bay FM in Byron Bay, Australia, at bayfm.org. Future Sense is available on iTunes and SoundCloud. The future is here now. It's just not evenly distributed.